coming back quickly now for the last session this afternoon, which was to be given to us by Karl Ameriks on the topic on Kant and the end of Theodicy. Oh, sorry. I should say that Karl comes from the University of Notre Dame.
Thanks. While we're fixing this, this is a long paper, I apologize, but I do have to give the thanks again. This has been an extraordinary event about whether there are extraordinary events, and I'm extraordinarily indebted to all the organizers, especially Tarek, though, for things even before this conference, and then for having a role in teaching on occasion, maybe people like Des and Andrew and so forth. So what happened is we did not do this together, and I'm not indebted to Eric's paper or Des's paper or Andrew's paper. This is like the Jewish translation of the Bible, where independently we came up with exactly the same story of Kant, I think, but I'm not sure. You can tell me later. Okay, many parts with a handout that Andrew helpfully put together. On Kant and the end of Theodicy, Section 1, Prolegomena. With respect to the diverse orders of God, nature, and humanity, there is a puzzle at the heart of Kant's Religion. I'll say that to refer to the book, and related works in his discussion of Theodicy and the role of miracles. The puzzle, which is kind of a rhetorical puzzle today for me, is whether and how in his discussion of Vernunftglaube, rational faith, the reasons why I used that funny word, Kant's commitment to a kind of pure moral interpretation of human progress, which may at first appear motivated largely by anti-supernatural Enlightenment ideas, can in the end be disentangled from an appeal to items that to many readers can seem miraculous themselves. Kant did not work out the complex theodicical is a word that some Kantians use, I didn't invent it, aspect of his conception of Vernunftglaube all at once. Its basic idea goes back decades, and Kant's late works contain a series of final fine-tunings that especially deserve close analysis. In addition to his massive and unexpected Religion from 1793 and several closely related 1780s essays on history, there's about a half dozen or more very relevant late essays from the 1790s. Taken together, these works constitute a bold attempt on Kant's part to shore up the whole Western teleological tradition in a way that is at once deeply religious, liberal, scientific, and philosophically nuanced. But Kant's attempt is also riddled, as Andrew said, with conundrums, theological conundrums especially. What I'll try to discuss is just a general philosophical puzzle that arises first specifically from his treatment of the supernatural at the very end of parts 1 and 2 of the religion. So the puzzle. In the long second edition note added to the end of the general remark at the end of the first of the 4 parts of the Religion, Kant makes explicit a theme common to each general remark that concludes a part of the book. Each general remark considers what Kant calls one of the 4 kinds of extravagant ideas that are peregra to pure moral religion, but understandably occur to reason as it reflects on its limitations. These 4 kinds of ideas are neatly organized under the headings of effects of grace, miracles, mysteries, and means of grace, but the ideas are not all on the same level, and determining exactly how they differ is no easy task. For our purposes, it'll be enough to concentrate on an issue related to the contrast between ideas of the first 2 kinds. Even though Kant never denies the possibility of miracles, which he defines early on as items that materially or formally, quote, interrupt the order of nature, he understandably seems increasingly interested in strongly discouraging appeal to them, especially, but not only, as means of grace. With respect to mere effects of grace, however, it turns out to be difficult to make sense of Vernunftglaube and its own central notion of hope without appealing to something very like a miracle. As his general remark stresses, and I think Andrew had this quote 1, Vernunftglaube involves not only an initial moral effort on our part, but also hope that then what does not lie in our power will be made good by cooperation or Mitwirkung from above. And the mention of Mitwirkung from above implies reference to some kind of effect of grace through a special action upon us by supernatural power. There are several specifically theological issues here, but there's also a general first philosophical challenge, I think, of finding a way to make sense of Kant's invocation of any non-naturally based effect, and seeing how this could be sufficiently unlike then superstitious reference to miracles, which he heavily criticizes in the Religion and other texts. One strategy for dispelling part, but only part of the problem, is to note that Kant distinguishes different ways of invoking ideas that go beyond ordinary nature, and he immediately adds explicit qualifications to his own reference to help from above. He stresses that Vernunftglaube, even in its most developed form, cannot be conviction or Überzeugung, and near the end of his discussion he says we cannot summon any effects of grace by incorporating them into a theoretical or practical maxim of reason. So the effects of grace, effects postulated with the conditions of rational hope, do not allow us to say either straightway how nature is to be characterized theoretically, nor given Kant's doctrine of autonomy can any appeal to them be put directly into a proper practical maxim. Kant may have felt a need to add this point, and perhaps the note as a whole to the Religion, precisely because otherwise it might appear unclear whether in regard to mere effects of grace he has anything very negative to say that would link up with the highly negative points about the supernatural elsewhere. Nonetheless, essential to Vernunftglaube, as Andrew reminded us, is hope, and essential to hope is still some kind of positive reference to some such effects. And these effects must be thought of as more than simply not impossible, for obviously such a weak thought could be had by all sorts of persons. It is not necessary in this context to make much more precise the status of Kantian hope as a specific epistemic attitude. My note here is that Andrew is going to do all that. So what matters for me is simply that there must be some kind of affirmative thought here, some holding to be true about some special effect, even though, as Kant repeatedly insists, this is a thought that's not absolutely certain, and it doesn't come with explanatory insight or Einsicht. So the main point I'll be stressing is that the perplexities just noted in the status of Vernunftglaube are also, for better or for worse, when you think about it, as Des was suggesting, relevant to the general notion of our free agency, which is nothing less than the keystone concept of the critical philosophy. And in the Religion, a positive reference is made to an effect of our free power of choice at 644, right at the very start of the first general remark. And yet, Kant repeatedly stresses that here, too, we can have no insight into the how, or even an unqualified certainty about the that, because we know it only as a fact of reason, which is therefore not demonstrable, and in that sense, mysterious. It requires it's not demonstrable in the sense it requires a first-person commitment to the non-natural demands of Kant's strict moral perspective. Kant's endorsement of absolute freedom is, to be sure, not completely on a par with his endorsement of the hope of moral faith. His analysis of hope has built into it a presumption of the first endorsement, whereas the mere analysis of our endorsement of freedom does not by itself entail the complexities of hope. Nonetheless, in Kant's system, the perplexing thought of our freedom still seems to me relevantly enough like the perplexing thought of effects of grace, insofar as both thoughts essentially involve a non-natural ground of empirical effects and do so in ways that are said to go beyond anything about which we can claim insight or unqualified certainty. Hence, even prior to Kant's carefully worded endorsement of the possible affirmation of the complex second-order effects in grace of an external higher freedom acting upon us in response to our devotional freedom, we have to face first the already more general interpretive puzzle of explaining the deep asymmetry between, on the one hand, Kant's very critical attitude toward affirming anything specifically miraculous, and on the other hand, his carefully worded but frequent affirmation of effects of our own everyday absolute freedom. Now, the issue of miracles dominates Kant's general remark to the Religion's second part, and its very critical tone is set in its very first sentence. So this is a lot of exposition, which proclaims that after the enlightened spread of Vernunftglaube, faith in miracles, Kant says, eventually be rendered in general dispensable. This remark is not declaring miracles non-existent or impossible, but it can be read, I think, as philosophically allowing the notion of them as little more than a bare logical possibility, one that has played an understandable but temporary role earlier in history simply because of lack of education. A distracting complication here is that because of matters having to do with sensitive church-state relations at the time, the Religion is especially concerned with arguing against the notion of public commitment to miracles as a test of faith or ministerial certification. But this focus on the political aspect of the issue should not distract us from the fact that Kant's also very opposed to the thought that faith requires any sort of private belief specifically in miracles. Because the requirements of Vernunftglaube must be of a sort that are in principle open to being satisfied by all human beings simply on the basis of their original full rational equipment, there's a kind of public condition, I believe, a condition on universal access on what one can even properly be expected to believe or affirm privately for Kant. This condition is taken to rule out requiring for genuine internal faith any appeal to a special experience of the miraculous that is any strictly local and historical event. Because a miracle, whether great or little, past or present, rare or repeated, must be thought of as a particular event essentially inconsistent with what Kant calls the order of worldly events. It's therefore also something that cannot be fairly expected to be affirmed by persons as such wherever they are. And so for Kant, belief in miracles cannot be required in any religion respecting the principles of rational autonomy. And if I get to the end, my point will be that this has problems maybe for Kant's own position, this condition, public condition. Kant's language in the Religion cleverly dances around the issue of exactly how to talk about miracles without being either offensive or untrue to his own religious concerns and critical perspective. This perspective cannot, of course, ever absolutely exclude non-natural sources for anything, and such sources are by no means a far-fetched option for Kant. He points out himself that even with respect to phenomena obeying natural laws, and this maybe should have been a quote on the sheet, the critical philosophy must, quote, renounce cognition of that which brings about effects according to these laws in itself. That is, given transcendental idealism, it follows that in principle, we can have no insight into the things themselves that in a sense ultimately do the genuine bringing about that goes beyond whatever we can know in terms of the relational properties governing spatial temporal phenomena. And Kant immediately adds that the same point applies in the context of our own self and its attempt at moral improvement where, quote, we have no understanding of how to distinguish with certainty non-natural influences from natural ones, so for all we know, heavenly influences might cooperate here and be necessary in an ultimate but to us inaccessible explanatory way. In alluding here to something beyond both external and internal phenomena, Kant is, I presume, not making a hypothetical statement, but is referring to a non-spatial temporal, we might say, I know not what, that he is obliged by a system to assert exists. At the same time, he has to say that we cannot determine specifically what it is beyond the very general characterization of it as whatever allows for experience and the fulfillment of our moral agency. For this reason, in addition to directly criticizing the main advocate at the time of appeal to miracles, Johann Caspar Lavater, Kant reiterates in a second edition footnote to the Religion the first part's key claim that no appeal to miracles ever to be brought into our theoretical or practical maxims. And here Kant does mention something loosely called, quote, a theistic miracle, but then he adds this is only a general concept of a creator and ruler of the world according to the order of nature. And so for Kant, this is precisely not the common concept, what he thinks is the common concept of a miracle as an event that's within the world, but not fitting in the order of nature. With respect to God's particular effects, beyond assuming that they would never violate theoretical or moral reason, Kant insists that our reason cannot, quote, ever hope to be instructed in the world, end of quote. And the final footnote to this remark, Kant speaks of how events that strike us as highly unusual are only so-called miracles of nature. They should not be presumed to be genuine miracles, for this would only confuse and deject our reason, and we would even have to worry that maybe all our supposed